Complex numbers, made easy. Let's start with an overview. Let's just say you want to take the square root of 4. And we know the square root of 4 is simply just 2. Now what happens if we want to take the square root of negative 4? Well, there are no two numbers that are the same that can multiply to give us a negative number. So in this case, what we have to do is actually rewrite this just like this. The square root of 4 times the square root of negative 1. Now what we have is the square root of 4, which is 2, times the square root of negative 1. Since you can't take the square root of a negative number, this right here, square root of negative 1, is equal to what we call an imaginary number, which is I. And we use I because writing the square root of negative 1 every time takes a little bit longer. So what we do in math is actually just make it a little bit more simple by just calling the square root of negative 1 equal to I. Now we know that I is called an imaginary number, and that I is just the square root of negative 1. A complex number consists of a real number and an imaginary number. The form of a complex number is A plus B times I, where A is the real part and B times I is the imaginary part. What happens if you square I? You would get I squared, which would be equal to negative 1. Negative 1 is a real number. Just a side note, this is what my profile picture on my YouTube channel represents. Example number 1, we want to go ahead and simplify. Whenever we want to simplify numbers like this where there's an imaginary part and real parts, all we do is we add the real parts together and then we add the imaginary parts together. So let's look at the real numbers here. We have 6 and we have 7. We can combine those since they're both real numbers. 6 plus 7 is going to give us 13. Now what we want to do is look at the imaginary numbers. In this case, we have 5i and negative 2i. Since they both have an I, we can go ahead and subtract these numbers. So we'll have 5i minus 2i, which is going to be positive 3i. And this right here is our final answer. Example number 2. We want to multiply 3i times negative 2i. Now, this is basically like treating I as a variable. You can imagine it like an X, a Y, or any other kind of variable that you've worked with before. All we do when we multiply is we just multiply the constants together. So we'll have 3 times negative 2, which gives us negative 6. And I times I will give us I squared. And now we know that I is equal to the square root of negative 1. So that means I squared is going to be equal to negative 1. So we can go ahead and simplify this further. What we'll have is negative 6 times I squared, which we know is negative 1. Negative 6 times 1 is going to be 6. And this is going to be our final answer. Example number 3. What we want to do is simplify. We have these two binomials here and we're going to multiply them. So first we look at the 2. We're going to multiply this times 3, which is going to give us 6. And then we have 2 times negative 2i, which will be negative 4i. From here, since we multiplied the 2 by everything in the other binomial, we're going to go ahead and multiply the I to both of these numbers as well. So I times 3 is positive 3i, and then I times negative 2i is negative 2i squared. What we know is that I squared is equal to negative 1. So let's go ahead and rewrite this. We'll have 6 minus 4i plus 3i minus 2 times I squared, which is negative 1. So now we have 6 minus 4i plus 3i plus 2. From here, we can go ahead and combine like terms. What we do when we're writing complex numbers is usually we'll write the real part first. So let's look at the real numbers. In this case, we'll have 6 and 2. 6 plus 2 will give us 8. And now for the imaginary numbers, what we have is negative 4i and plus 3i. When you add those together, what we'll have is negative I. And this right here is going to be our final answer.